A needle pierces the skin, delivering what is supposed to be a lifeline. For thousands of French citizens in the early 1980s, this routine medical procedure was an act of absolute faith. They extended their arms to the very institutions sworn to protect them, unaware that the vials of blood-clotting agents entering their veins were laced with a fatal contagion. This was not a tragic accident born of scientific ignorance. It was a calculated, lethal gamble made in the shadowed corridors of power, transforming a sanctuary of healing into a mechanism of mass infection. The victims were primarily hemophiliacs, individuals whose bodies lacked the essential proteins to stop bleeding. Their survival depended entirely on regular infusions of factor VIII, a concentrate pooled from the blood plasma of thousands of donors. To live, they had to trust the absolute purity of the national supply. But the sanctity of that supply had already been breached. The emerging, terrifying specter of HIV was quietly infiltrating the donor pool, turning the life-saving concentrate into a silent, catastrophic threat that would soon ravage an entire community of vulnerable patients. When the diagnosis eventually came, it arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a creeping, agonizing realization. Families watched helplessly as their loved ones withered from an unknown, wasting disease, their immune systems collapsing under the weight of a virus they had been injected with by their own trusted doctors. The psychological devastation compounded the physical agony in ways that are difficult to articulate. To discover that the source of your salvation is the precise instrument of your demise fractures the very foundation of human trust, leaving a permanent scar on the psyche. The architecture of this deception was built on cold financial calculus and a deeply toxic strain of national pride. By 1984, the international medical community recognized the severe, undeniable risk of transmitting HIV through pooled blood products. Crucially, safer alternatives already existed. American pharmaceutical companies had developed a reliable method to heat-treat the plasma, effectively neutralizing the virus without destroying the clotting factors. Yet this life-saving technology was deliberately kept out of France. At the center of this fatal delay stood Dr. Michel Garetta, the powerful head of the National Blood Transfusion Center. Historical records and internal documents confirm that Garetta and his senior colleagues were acutely aware that the domestic, untreated blood stock was heavily contaminated. A chilling internal memo from the era estimated that nearly all Parisian hemophiliacs would be infected if the current, dangerous methods continued. Despite this horrific, quantified calculus, the decision was made to exhaust the existing, tainted inventory rather than absorb the financial loss. The motivation extended far beyond mere cost-saving measures. The French government, prioritizing domestic industry and scientific prestige, wanted to wait for a homegrown heat treatment process to be perfected. They deliberately stalled the approval and import of the safe American products, effectively holding the lives of their most vulnerable citizens hostage to economic nationalism. For agonizing months, the National Blood Transfusion Center continued to distribute the lethal vials, knowingly playing Russian roulette with thousands of lives to protect a national monopoly. Those months of calculated delay sealed the fate of an entire generation. Mothers unknowingly infused their children with the virus at the kitchen table. Husbands unwittingly transmitted the infection to their wives. The betrayal seeped into the most intimate, sacred corners of their lives, leaving a legacy of profound guilt, paralyzing grief, and unanswerable questions. The state had not merely failed in its duty of care, it had actively prioritized profit and prestige over their fundamental right to exist. The deception was maintained through a sophisticated, institutional campaign of gaslighting. Gaslighting, in this context, refers to the systematic psychological manipulation that makes victims question their own reality and valid fears. When anxious patients and their families began to question the safety of the treatments based on international news, they were met with reassuring platitudes from authoritative figures in white coats. Doctors, many of whom were themselves kept in the dark by the central authorities, unknowingly parroted the official deadly line. They told their terrified patients that the risks were wildly exaggerated by the media, that the French blood supply was uniquely secure, and that stopping the vital infusions would be far more dangerous than continuing them. This manipulation of authority twisted the fundamental dynamic of medical care. Patients were conditioned to suppress their own survival instincts, overriding their growing dread with enforced compliance. They continued to accept the tainted vials, participating in their own slow destruction out of an ingrained, unwavering respect for medical expertise. The facade began to crack only when the sheer volume of infections could no longer be dismissed as statistical anomalies or unfortunate, isolated outliers. Independent researchers started noticing terrifying, undeniable clusters of immune deficiency among hemophiliacs across the country. The virus was leaving a visible trail of devastation that directly contradicted the government's soothing, fabricated narratives. Small discrepancies in official health reports caught the attention of a few relentless journalists who refused to accept the state-sanctioned version of events. These investigators, working alongside desperate whistleblowers, uncovered a terrifying timeline of willful negligence. They found that in the spring of 1985, even as the government finally prepared to mandate the heating of all blood products, a secret, devastating directive was issued to regional blood centers. The order explicitly instructed them to use up their existing non-heated stocks first. The state was essentially clearing its lethal inventory, squeezing every last franc out of the contaminated plasma before the new safety regulations took effect. The silence could not hold against the weight of this evidence. As the death toll mounted into the hundreds, a courageous coalition of grieving mothers, infected patients, and tenacious reporters began to aggressively dig through the bureaucratic wreckage. They were not just fighting a terminal disease, they were fighting a deeply entrenched establishment desperate to conceal its catastrophic culpability. The pursuit of truth required unearthing suppressed documents, challenging the closed ranks of the medical elite, and exposing a cover-up that reached the highest echelons of the state. Investigative reports began to tear away the veil of plausible deniability, publishing the memos that proved the danger was not just known but actively managed and subsequently ignored. The narrative of a tragic, unavoidable medical disaster began to crumble entirely, replaced by the grim reality of deliberate, calculated negligence. The public watched in absolute horror as the mechanics of the betrayal were laid bare, revealing a terrifying callousness within the health ministry and the blood transfusion service. The mounting outrage culminated in a ferocious demand for accountability that shook the political foundations of the French Republic. It was no longer enough to merely mourn the dead or offer empty apologies. The survivors demanded severe criminal justice. The scandal forced an unprecedented legal reckoning, dragging powerful, previously untouchable figures out of their comfortable boardrooms and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the courtroom. The indictment of senior health officials shattered the long-held illusion of medical infallibility. Dr. Michel Garetta was ultimately convicted of knowingly distributing contaminated products. He received a 4-year prison sentence, a penalty that many victims and their families felt was agonizingly inadequate compared to the mass casualty event he had orchestrated. The trial exposed the dark underbelly of a bureaucratic system where ethical obligations were easily discarded in favor of administrative convenience and financial targets. The courtroom testimonies painted a harrowing picture of institutional arrogance, where human lives were reduced to mere data points on a balance sheet. The shockwaves of the investigation reached the very top of the political hierarchy, breaking new legal ground. Former Prime Minister Laurent Fabius, along with 2 of his senior cabinet ministers, faced unprecedented charges of manslaughter. The spectacle of a former head of government standing trial for a public health catastrophe was a watershed moment in modern French history. It forced a painful, highly public national dialogue about the boundaries of political immunity and the ultimate responsibility of the state toward its vulnerable citizens. However, the pursuit of justice in the political arena proved to be a frustrating labyrinth of legal technicalities, jurisdictional disputes, and shifting blame. While the health ministers faced intense scrutiny and partial convictions, Laurent Fabius was ultimately acquitted. The court ruled that he had not been fully informed of the immediate danger by his subordinates. This verdict left a bitter, lingering taste of unresolved grief and profound disillusionment for the families of the victims who had fought so hard for total accountability. The trials themselves became a deeply traumatic theater of emotional agony. Survivors took the stand, their bodies bearing the visible, devastating ravages of the disease, to confront the men who had effectively signed their death warrants. They recounted the sheer terror of their diagnoses, the heavy social stigma of living with HIV in the 1980s, and the agonizing betrayal of learning that their suffering was entirely preventable. Their raw testimonies stripped away the bureaucratic jargon, exposing the bleeding human heart of the scandal. Defense attorneys attempted to contextualize the fatal decisions, pointing to the scientific uncertainty of the early 1980s and the immense, unprecedented pressure of managing a national health crisis. They argued that hindsight is a merciless judge and that the officials were operating in a fog of war against a novel, poorly understood pathogen. But the prosecution countered with cold, undeniable documentation. The memos, the financial projections, and the deliberate suppression of safety data proved that the fog of war was merely a convenient smokescreen for willful blindness. The legal battles dragged on for over a decade, a grueling marathon of appeals and retrials that outlasted many of the victims who had initiated the lawsuits. The slow, grinding machinery of the justice system seemed fundamentally ill-equipped to handle a crime of this magnitude, nuance, and institutional complexity. Every delay, every overturned ruling, and every acquitted official felt like a fresh insult to the families, a grim reinforcement of the terrifying idea that true accountability is an illusion when the state itself is the perpetrator. The high-profile acquittals underscored the agonizing reality of systemic betrayal. When the architecture of deception is vast, decentralized, and deeply institutionalized, pinning down absolute individual accountability becomes a frustrating, often futile endeavor. The survivors were left to navigate a world where many of the architects of their suffering walked free, protected by the very legal frameworks that had utterly failed to safeguard their health in the first place. The wounds inflicted by the state's negligence were perpetually deepened by the state's failure to deliver unequivocal justice. Despite the failures of the courtroom, the French tainted blood scandal permanently altered the global landscape of medical ethics and public health policy. It served as a grim, undeniable catalyst for the implementation of the precautionary principle. This principle mandates that in the face of suspected severe harm to the public, protective action must be taken immediately, even without absolute, peer-reviewed scientific certainty. The tragedy forced a complete systemic overhaul of the blood donation and distribution networks, embedding rigorous screening and sterilization protocols that are now the international standard. Yet these vital, life-saving reforms were purchased at an unimaginable, horrific cost. Over 4,000 people were infected with HIV, and hundreds of hemophiliacs ultimately succumbed to AIDS-related complications, suffocating in hospital beds while the trials dragged on. The modern safety protocols stand as a silent monument to the dead, written in the blood of those who were sacrificed on the altar of bureaucratic hubris. The legacy of the scandal is a perpetual, haunting reminder that constant vigilance is the only true defense against institutional apathy. For the families who remain, the grief is a quiet, enduring, and heavy presence. The empty chairs at dinner tables and the faded photographs on mantels are daily testaments to a trust that was violently, irreparably broken. They live with the agonizing knowledge that their loved ones were not victims of an unstoppable, natural plague, but direct casualties of a conscious, calculated human decision. The echoes of that manipulation still linger in their minds, a phantom pain that no legal verdict or systemic reform can ever fully heal. The perpetrators of this historical tragedy rarely fit the profile of conventional monsters. They were highly educated professionals, decorated civil servants, and respected physicians who believed they were managing a complex system. Their descent into moral bankruptcy was not marked by overt malice, but by a terrifying bureaucratic detachment. They allowed abstract concepts like market share, national pride, and budget deficits to completely eclipse the visceral, undeniable reality of human suffering, proving that the most profound betrayals often occur not in the dark, but under the harsh, fluorescent lights of administrative offices,